and how did we get here? And I'm not going to go through the whole history of the special military operation, but I will say that back in May of this year, when the United States Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, authorizing some $43 billion of U.S. taxpayer money to be used to fund, underwrite, not just the Ukrainian military, but the Ukrainian state, basically, providing a lifeline to the Ukrainian state. And this was matched by NATO countries providing heavy equipment, et cetera. I call it a game-changing event. And I got a lot of pushback from people. They're like, oh, you're flip-flopping. It's a great switcheroo. You were so pro-Russia. And I'm not pro-Russia. I'm pro-fact. I'm pro, solid analysis. And, the fact is, when Russia initiated the special military operation, they brought in a finite number of military resources for a very specific military problem, which was the liberation of the Donbass, the Donetsk and the Lugansk People's Republic. That included creating a land bridge from Crimea through Kherson, Zaporizhia. It included other supporting military actions to fix Ukrainian forces in place, et cetera. But still, a limited number of people for a limited problem. By infusing tens of billions of dollars worth of hardware, Ukraine and NATO and the United States literally changed the game. It no longer was a struggle between the Ukrainian army and the Russian army. It became the struggle between the Russian military and a NATO proxy. Now, simply saying you're going to provide equipment and actually having that equipment received, have the Ukrainians train on it, organize it into operational units and bring those units to the battlefield, there's a time gap. So calling it a game-changing event and actually having the game change took time. The game changed sometime in August when Ukraine started to receive these units, these reconstituted NATO units, even though they're Ukrainian manned, they're de facto NATO proxies. And then they deployed them, and starting on or about September 1st, they began this counteroffensive against the Russians. And this is where the inadequacy of the Russian force structure came into being. You have a front of 1,000 kilometers. You have 200,000 troops allocated for this task. That's 200 men per kilometer. That's not that many. But you can't just have them all up in the front online. You have to actually, have troops in the rear, in the depth, doing other things. So the bottom line is you actually had about 30 to 60 men per kilometer for the Russians. This is not doctrinal. This is not ideal. And the Ukrainians, using intelligence information provided by NATO, were able to find the seams, the weak spots in the Russian defense and exploit them. And once they punched through the defense, there was nothing in the rear to stop them. And they were able to gobble up a whole bunch of territory, especially up north in Kharkov. I think Russia woke up at that point and said, we have a problem. We have forces that are inadequate for this new reality, that this NATO army that's been assembled by Ukraine has the tactical and operational advantage. And if we don't do something, they'll get the strategic advantage, meaning they're going to change the entire narrative of this conflict. So Russia made two decisions. One was to initiate partial mobilization. That is to bring in 300,000 troops, all of whom have combat experience or prior military experience, and to organize them into units that will be brought to the theater of operations and supplement and reinforce the existing force structure, taking it basically from around 200,000 to 500,000. This is a significant thing. But the other thing was, if NATO is going to have a game-changing moment, Russia just changed the game, and the way they did that was by holding referendum. And they immediately turned this conflict from one where these NATO proxies were fighting Russian forces on Ukrainian soil, and they turned it into one where NATO proxies are fighting Russians on Russian soil. And that's a totally different thing. Russia just turned this conflict into one of an existential nature for them. They're defending the motherland, defending the homeland. This means that Russia's coming in with a completely different mindset. This is about the survival of a nation. It means that Russia can't lose, simply can't lose this. They can't afford to lose this, so they won't lose. Russia will do whatever's necessary to win. NATO, on the other hand, this isn't an existential crisis for NATO. NATO doesn't have an obligation to commit suicide for Ukraine, but NATO has overcommitted itself. They've made it too many political promises. They've provided significant, contributions, and so NATO's sort of what I call the horns of a dilemma. No matter what they do, they're going to get impaled. If they go left, they get impaled. They go right, they get impaled. There's no easy solution at this. If you go right and continue to provide this equipment, it becomes a NATO conflict against Russia. And that has the danger of expanding the scope and scale of this conflict so that two nuclear powers are facing off, and increases the probability of using nuclear weapons. Clearly, NATO doesn't want that. We saw when Zelensky made his emergency application for accelerated membership of NATO, both NATO and the United States went, well, no, 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 not so fast. We don't want to have any part of that, because they know what it means. Zelensky was basically asking NATO to commit suicide. And what do I mean by that? Zelensky knows that he's at war with Russia. Zelensky knows that there was a referenda, and that from a constitutional law perspective, the Russians view the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk as being Russia now. So if Zelensky and Ukraine join NATO, NATO will be at war with Russia on day one. And what will happen then is that NATO will cease to exist, because Russia will launch nuclear weapons and destroy all of NATO. Russia is not going to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Ukraine does not pose an existential threat to Russia. NATO intervening in Ukraine for the purpose of seizing Mother Russia, which now Kherson, Crimea, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Lugansk, they're now Mother Russia. So now this is about people coming in and trying to seize Mother Russia. That's as if somebody came to the United States and said, I'm not at war with America, but I'm just going to take Florida. I think the United States would say, no, you're not. We're going to fight to the death over Florida. We'll fight to the death over Maine. We'll fight to the death over any part that is the United States. And that's what Russia's going to do. They're going to fight to the death for Russia. So for NATO, now they're not willing to commit suicide. That became apparent. What NATO's going to do, however, can they just dump Ukraine? Remember, they just dumped Afghanistan last year. Are they going to dump Ukraine? That's the other horn of the dilemma. So NATO's going to try and find the middle ground, which is equally bad a solution. That is to continue to provide military hardware, financial assistance, to empower the Ukrainians to do whatever Ukraine needs to do, but keep NATO out of the conflict. It's that while this may be a proxy conflict, NATO itself is not going to get involved in this conflict. This means that a couple things. Tens of thousands of more Ukrainians are condemned to death because of this decision. And I think people need to reflect on that anybody that says we need to support Ukraine, you're literally saying we need to support the continued slaughter of Ukrainian soldiers. In this counteroffensive that Ukraine has run, the Ukrainians themselves have acknowledged over 20,000 casualties. And Ukrainian civilians are going to die. Not only that, this conflict will probably expand to the point where Russia will be compelled to take more territories: Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Nikolaev, Kharkov. That means that Ukraine will not just lose the 20% they already have, they probably will lose another 20%. So they could lose 40, 50% of their country before this is done. It means the death of Ukraine, the end of Ukraine. That's what NATO's done. NATO is sacrificing the Ukrainian nation for their own pride, for their own hubris. At the end of the day, Ukraine is going to lose. That's a reality, and Russia has changed. It's right now things look difficult for the Russians, because no matter how we cut the pie, they still only have 30 to 60 guys per kilometer of frontage. They're trying their best right now to consolidate their defenses, to increase the number of troops, to make sure there's interlocking defenses, et cetera. But until they get the 300,000 people mobilized, there's a problem. But let's talk about the 300,000 for a second. A lot of people are saying, they're going to be poorly trained troops. These aren't the elite. They're not going to be able to do what the regular troops do. I disagree 100%. First of all, they all have military experience. They've all served before. But let's just reflect on American history for a second. A guy named Rick Atkinson wrote a trilogy about the history of the United States Army. in the Second World War. And it's interesting. He talks about the failures of the army early on, the Battle of Kasserine Pass in North Africa, um, how we had to replace a failed general, Fredericks, with this new general whose name was George Patton. Patton sort of transformed the army, and the army transformed with him. It became by 1945 the one of the largest armies in the world. It was the most professional military force that was almost exclusively manned by amateurs. What I mean is that people didn't sign up to make the military their profession. They were drafted, brought in to do a job, win the war, and then come home. And they were very, very good at what they did. I think these 300,000 are cut from that same piece of cloth. These are men who had already served their nation. Um, they're men who willingly were mobilized, willingly went off to the training, but they want to go home to their families, to their jobs, to the lives that they had that were outside of the military. And they know that the quickest way home is to get the job done, accomplish the mission. So these 300,000 are going to be singularly focused on one thing and one thing only, and that's winning this war. That makes them very, very dangerous. Um, I think anybody who minimizes the impact that these 300,000 have just don't understand, how mobilizations in times like this work. Again, I bring up the American model. I think the Russians are going to have their own version of that. 300,000 citizen soldiers who are going to become very professional, very quick, and very focused on winning this conflict. So people need to reflect on that.